Do you know the world is a foul sty? Do you know if you rip the fronts off houses you'd find swine?
I don't want you to touch my mother. So go away, I'm warning you. Go away or I'll kill you myself.
Morrison isn't his real name.
What is it?
God knows, we don't. His personal history was falsified. His prints were untraceable. It was possible Morrison had done it before.
You can call me sentimental, I don't care. I have beautiful friends, I have a wonderful new family. Oh, that guy in Bellevue that killed his whole family. Cut him up with knives. Maybe they disappointed him.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare, from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on, and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise, and at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoid, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon.
We're talking bored, paranoid men that don't trust their neighbors. Join the sleaze.
We decide on all the official ratings and rankings for every film that we cover. Patreon subscribers also get an on-air shout-out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we have been doing for almost 3 years now, which is insane. There's something like 70-plus bonus episodes waiting for you if you haven't made the jump yet. Again, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. If you haven't done that, I'd recommend it. And speaking of which, we do have some people who made the jump this week, so we're going to give them their shout-outs here. We have Paul Myrick, Eddie Averill, Eddie, a friend of the show. He's actually going to be coming on the show soon.
Nice.
So thank you, Eddie. Matthias, Brandon Estevez, witty username. Well done. Louis Adams and Sam DeChristopher. Those are all the new patrons this week. Hope you guys are enjoying all the bonus content. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
That's the one plug. The other plug for the week, as always, is Apple Podcasts. If you guys are listening on Apple Podcasts, and I see the stats, I see you right now listening on Apple Podcasts. While you're listening to this, scroll to the very bottom and give us a good old rating and review down there. It helps us climb the ranks and find new listeners, and we appreciate that. The other plug for the week is the new plug is merch. If you guys like the art that horror artist based out of Toronto, Trevor Henderson, did for us for the show, you can get that pretty much put on anything you'd like: a shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a mask, whatever you want. The link to that is in the description of this episode, and also at sleazoidspodcast.com if you're interested in anything like that. And all right. It's the intro is becoming a mouthful, but I'm getting used to it. We're getting through a little bit faster. Welcome back. As always, I'm your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, is my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome back. I think 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you folks would have heard from us, and we would have been talking with special guest Violet Luca, who brought with her The Other Side of the Underneath from 1972 and Biggest Luna's Anguish from 1987. We talked about all kinds of sort of metatextual violence and madness taking place on the screen. And we had a blast talking about with her. We can't really give log lines for either film because they are very hard to describe that way. All I can say is go back and check it out. Yeah. Violet had a lot of really insightful things to say about those films. We were glad to talk about those with her. So that was last week's free episode. Again, any podcast listener of choice. And then for patrons, last week we did your bonus voted episode because once every 2 months we have you guys nominate double features and vote on them, which we're actually having the patrons do right now as well. They're going through and voting on the next episode, but we did the ones that they voted on previously, and we did Walter Hill's The Driver from 1978 as well as Michael Mann's Thief from 1981. We talked about sort of melancholy craftsmen navigating their underworlds, and it was a big beefy episode. Because it happens anytime you guys get us talking about Michael Mann. It just happens that way. Again, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast if you want to listen to that episode. That was last week's bonus episode. But this week, we have a very special guest joining us. He is a contributing editor at CinemaScope. He's a writer for The Ringer. Many of you have posted that you've purchased his books in our podcast Discord, so you should be familiar with him. He did the It Doesn't Suck Showgirls, a book that Jamie absolutely
Nice.
has to read because
Yes.
Jamie is in absolute agreement. But he's also written
Good
about Paul
movie.
Thomas Anderson, the Coen brothers, Ben Wheatley. Joining us this week is Adam Nayman. Adam, how are you doing?
Hey, gentlemen, how you doing?
Good. Thanks
Doing
for
great.
coming on.
As well as we can be, I feel like.
Yeah.
Pleasure. It's a very idyllic Friday. I'm looking out my office window at some snow.
Yep.
You know,
Me too.
I'm just in a nice mood.
That's right. Well, hopefully we don't ruin it by getting into the deep underbelly of suburban American life this week.
No, I can't wait.
But yeah, Adam, as the show goes, we have the guests bring on the double features with them. So what two films have you brought with you this week, and why did you pair them together?
Well, it's a pairing that, while I've seen alluded to here and there, I hadn't really seen it front and center anywhere, and it just seems very intuitive and fun, which is to take Alfred Hitchcock's 1943 film Shadow of a Doubt, which, depending on where you read, you'll find Hitchcock sort of saying either that he thinks it was, one of his favorite of his films, perhaps the best realized of his films, a very transitional work for him in that it was maybe the first fully American of his films, or it's a movie that has Americana kind of deep in its marrow. And pair it with another movie about kind of suburban America in a very different time and place and political context, and also that contains, I think, some pretty deliberate references to Shadow of a Doubt, which is Joseph Rubin's The Stepfather. And the common denominator between these movies, we might say, is a small town setting as a, not exactly an incubator, but a habitat and a kind of a hiding place for sociopathic characters who are, let's say, apt to exercise their frustrations with the world around them in very violent ways. In Shadow of a Doubt, you have a character played by Joseph Cotton, whose name is Charles Oakley, who we don't know this specifically about him from the beginning, but he seems to be in some kind of shady situation or trouble. We find out later this owes to the fact that he is moonlighting as a serial killer, the so-called Merry Widow killer, and as a way of evading the heat and discovery, he hides out in this little town, Santa Rosa, California, with his family, where his past and reputation kind of catch up to him, seen from the point of view of his niece, who's named for him. His niece is also named Charlie. And the movie kind of ping-pongs between the point of view of these two characters, but settles mostly with her after introducing him. And as she comes to sort of realize what the movie has had us suspect about her uncle from the beginning, which is that he's a very bad dude. And the terror and the disillusionment of that, and the creepiness of these two characters who share a name, who share a real kind of relationship and affection for each other, almost as if she's measuring the possible distance between herself and her namesake. Like, if I identify with this man, am I a little bit like him? And then in The Stepfather, you have a movie that's much more from the point of view of the killer, this shape-shifting, name-changing, highly malleable character, Henry Morrison, later also who goes by the name of Jerry Blake, who kind of moves from family to family and town to town until he finds a family that won't disappoint him to the point of him killing them, right? and
Every man's struggle,
And so he's the Uncle Charlie figure in that movie, and then the young Charlie figure is his stepdaughter Stephanie, who, like young Charlie in Shadow of a Doubt, suspects that this father figure, more literally a father figure in this case, but a stepfather, is harboring some dark secrets, is up to some bad stuff. And I wouldn't say that the psychological architecture of The Stepfather is as complicated as Shadow of the Doubt. I mean, Shadow of a Doubt's really a movie about character. The Stepfather is kind of like, will the cops find out in time? Will our madman be stopped? But it kind of has a similar, and I think in its own self-contained way, really kind of delightful and Hitchcockian relationship to, I would call it like the suspense and dread of normalcy. You know, the idea that these very normal, banal, everyday situations, have this lurking threat of violence and exposure within them. So they're both kind of like small town studies. They both are studies of sociopathology. They have these wonderful kind of paranoid set pieces to them, and I think they're also both very funny. And I think maybe talking about the comedy in both movies would be fun, because rewatching both of them in preparation for this, I found myself sort of just delighted by their wittiness, which is maybe more refined in Shadow of a Doubt, but Stepfather's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah, in a very perverse way it is.
Yeah.
I mean, after you get over the initial shock of the stepfather, the actual sort of like suspense sequences that take place, it doesn't quite get to as shocking of a place as you are in that opening scene, which maybe we'll get to when we jump into the stepfather. But that's a great intro, and I think we're gonna start off by jumping right into it like we usually do. We're gonna start, I think, chronologically here, and we're gonna start with Shadow of a Doubt. So let's do it.
Do you know the world is a foul sty? Do you know if you ripped the fronts off houses, you'd find swine?
I don't want you to touch my mother. So go away, I'm warning you. Go away or I'll kill you myself. Your hands. Oh, let me go, Uncle Charlie. Let me go.
All right, we are talking Shadow of a Doubt, the 1943 American psychological thriller film noir, as they have listed here, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Obviously, the film very loosely, as Adam kind of laid out in the intro there, follows Teresa Wright and Joseph Cotton, both playing characters named Charlie. Joseph Cotton is Uncle Charlie Oakley, a very sort of suspicious man who is making his way back to... Is it ever said that it's their hometown? Is Santa Rosa, California, where the whole family is from?
Yeah, I think that he makes reference to some street. He's talking to his sister, to young Charlie's mother, and saying that, once upon a time she was the prettiest little girl in the neighborhood, or the prettiest girl from that place. So I think the idea is that Charlie started there, went out in the world, and came back. But I'm not sure that it's supposed to be his childhood home that he's he's returning to.
Right. Well, either way, he returns to Santa Rosa, California, where his niece, Charlotte, or Charlie, named after him, is very excited to see her uncle return home, but very quickly she gets a kind of sense that something is off about this return. He is on the run from these two dudes who you're not really sure exactly what they are. We come to learn that they're detectives at a certain point. But what I found most interesting about Shadow of a Doubt, especially the first time I watched it, was that Hitchcock, especially at this time, was very well known for kind of like the wrongly accused kind of man. It was a man on the run. So when you first open and you see Charlie, it's this great kind of like wordless shot of, it has sort of like the high society dancing, but then it kind of blends into, this big pan of kind of like the outskirts of like this polluted city. I think they said they shot it in like New Jersey. There's like broken down cars, and then there's this, dilapidated buildings, and then there's Charlie. He's sitting in, this sort of like motel room. He's smoking a cigar alone. There's this great push in on him. There's a pile of money right next to him. It's essentially doing that same shot that we're going to be talking about next week from like Rear Window, where you kind of get all the information about Jimmy Stewart's character just panning over the things that are on his desk. Right. And you see that this guy doesn't think too highly of money, or he has a lot of money and he doesn't care about it.
Yeah, just tossing it on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, and you get the impression right away that this is just another one of Hitchcock's men on the run. You're not exactly sure why, but he's on the run from something. And I love the sort of sense of ambiguity that he gives to you before eventually exposing this film, as Adam kind of laid out. We're about to find out that this is much closer to, sort of like the precursors of what would become something like The Stepfather, something like serial killer films from the point of view, something that he would obviously very much coin in Psycho.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about that opening sequence, which I love, and even before the opening sequence, you alluded to the kind of the credits which play under this waltz, right? Mm-hmm. Which, it's funny. David Lynch has said that Shadow of a Doubt was a big influence on Blue Velvet, and that's true. But this kind of sort of floating, almost purely graphic opening sequence of these waltzing dancers reminds me of the Jitterbug at the beginning of Mulholland Drive. Sort of just this kind of like this sort of weird, disconnected, not really narratively driven vision of ballroom dancing, which creates kind of like a stately, elegant, whimsical kind of precursor to what comes, and bears out in the rest of the movie through the use of the Merry Widow waltz and the idea of the Merry Widow killer. But when you get to the scene you're talking about, he's not the wrong man, right? He's kind of the right man in this case, or he's not wrongly accused of anything. I mean, he's exactly what he appears to be, right? Which is, kind of a scumbag, and one who's very idle in that opening scene. I mean, for a guy on the run, he's sort of completely horizontal and very contemplative and pensive. And I mean, in a couple of minutes after that, he kind of gets up and makes his escape, which is a really good scene. It's shot really the high roof angle where you see the guys converging, and he's gone, and he's kind of watching them from this elevated perch, like he's way above them, literally and figuratively. Yeah. But like in that first scene, he's just kind of like sitting around, being bored, as you say. He's kind of bored with money, but it's also this kind of very retiring attitude he has towards the world, like he just kind of wants to sit around and stew in his misanthropy. And when he's on the train to Santa Rosa a little later, it's also all about him hiding out. Like he pretends to be sick, right? Which is partially to avoid detection, obviously, and there's a motif through the whole movie that you would have in a movie like The Wrong Man about trying to avoid detection. But he also just doesn't like people. He doesn't like engaging with them. I mean, and then when he finds the people who he likes, when he gets back to Santa Rosa and finds his family, there's like this weird mix of affection and kind of contempt that he has, like for his sister's husband, for Charlie's father, who works at the bank. He's like nice to him, but kind of hectors him a little bit when he comes to visit him in his place of work, and talks about how he doesn't like the bank and how he doesn't like money. Like he's very performative in that sense when he feels he has the power in a particular situation or group of people. And so like because young Charlie, the Teresa Wright character, who's very precocious and who idolizes him, because she's kind of the dominant figure in her household, right? Not in terms of authority, but in terms of personality. And because she totally idolizes him and loves him, he kind of swoops right in, and he's just like at the head of the household. He shows up, and he's kind of special, and it's a big deal that he's come there, and everyone's kind of happy to see Uncle Charlie. So he's a bit more in his element. But the performance by Cotton just radiates with such misanthropy and contempt and disinterest for other people. And that's why the shift to Teresa Wright is such a relief, because a movie from Uncle Charlie's point of view would be extremely uncomfortable. And as it is, the movie that Hitchcock made is still uncomfortable, but in a different way, because we're with this character and we're sort of wondering, well, what does she see in him, and when is she going to stop seeing it in him? Because she's our conduit into the movie, and her love for her Uncle Charlie is very complicated.
And I love that.
Yeah,
go ahead, Josh.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I really love that Hitchcock gets at that sort of contradiction between those two characters in just like the sort of like broad structure of having this man return back to his hometown. He observes the sort of cartoonishly pure like family unit, and he looks at it both in a sense that it's kind of adorable, it's trusting, but it's also naive to him in a way. He kind of sees it and he likes it. He sees that as something other people want to believe in, almost, is kind of what he looks at it and sees. And I love watching Cotton's performance in where he will like he will flip from kind of this performance of the sort of domestic kind, the cool uncle who comes in. He brings everyone presents. Everyone loves him. He comes to the town and they have like a welcoming home ceremony for him because he's just such a cool guy and everyone knows him. And it's such a small town that the local traffic cop knows everyone's name and everything like that. But then he will flip in his performance to just something that's so menacing and so sociopathic so quickly. Like when he looks at, his sister and finds out that, there's two men who are coming pretending to be these guys taking this sort of national survey, and he realizes right away that these are the detectives looking for him, and he's like, you welcomed these two men into your home and just said, yeah, walk around, take pictures, ask us incredibly invasive questions, even though, naturally she's just like, I'm just doing a survey. They said that they liked our family and that I wanted to show our family off and take a picture of our family because we are a postcard perfect looking family in an amazing town and everything like that. She doesn't quite understand. But what's so fascinating about the way that Hitchcock develops this and in the way that he, did in so many of his films where he welcomed you into that very subjective psychological process of sort of like the form as the mind at work. And by letting you go into, as we break into sort of like the young Charlie's point of view, I really love how Charlie is the one who she spots the seams. She sees the performance that he's putting on. She sees the sort of the seediness start to spread and kind of infect her home.
Yeah, like one of my favorite shots is the initial meeting of Charlie and Uncle Charlie when he gets off of the train and he's still kind of playing sick, like he's kind of limping and he's kind of hunched over because he's still playing that character for the people on the train. And as he slowly approaches Charlie, he gets more and more proper and becomes the uncle that she knows and loves, quote unquote.
Well, it's like the last shot of The Usual Suspects in reverse.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
But I mean, but Hitchcock also, and this has been, I mean, anyone who writes about Shadow of a Doubt writes about this, but he creates that relationship between them, which is partially one of complicity and partially one of exposure and discovery, by introducing Teresa Wright in the same position that he introduces Cotton. Right?
Yes.
I mean,
she's the exact same push-in on her bed.
Same push-in. She's lying there almost as if she's daydreaming about or wanting to summon him, and that's referenced several times in the dialogue that she's going to go send a telegram to her Uncle Charlie because she's bored, but he's already on the way. Mm-hmm. And he descends into this picture, as you call it, this picture postcard town, and the mapping of that town is where Lynch definitely took something from Shadow of a Doubt. The opening montage of Blue Velvet is like a color version, a Midwestern kind of color version of the black and white montage at the beginning of Shadow of a Doubt that shows, the crossing guard and the cars and the town. It's very similar, right? Mm-hmm. Charlie descends into that. And at first, what passes between them is one kind of recognition, which is we are the same. And then the rest of the movie is a different kind of recognition, as you alluded to from young Charlie's part, which is we are not the same. He is very different, but does the fact that I can tell this about him and see this about him, and does the fact that I'm keeping it to myself indicate that actually we, on a deeper level, we kind of are the same? Because the whole suspense of the movie pivots on young Charlie kind of not saying anything, which is similar to the withholding and the kind of the secretiveness of her uncle. I mean, in this case, she's being secretive about what he's secretive about. But it's an interesting form of suspense. The movie is much shorter, and again, I'm not being what one of Hitchcock calls the plausibles, where it's like the plot doesn't make sense. I think the plot in Shadow of a Doubt is great, but it's a much shorter movie. If Charlie is the kind of person who immediately runs to young Charlie is the kind of person who immediately runs to the authorities about something.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and the thing that's interesting is what it kind of codes a little bit is this idea that, he talks to her and he praises her for being kind of smart and for being witty and for being someone who, has the similar skills that he has that he then uses to murder and cover up his murders. But it's like, would she then notice those things if she didn't have those skills, right? It becomes a thing of, those skills make her spot those seams. And, and also in some ways, guide her to feel it necessary to, slowly pull at them and unravel them until, her world kind of breaks down. I think of like that bar scene where he just basically straight up admits that he's the killer right in front of her, and very brutally, tries to break, what we have seen this far, which is the, this sort of domestic suburban dream, this sort of idea of the picture postcard perfect thing where it's hiding or harboring much darker, sort of sicker things. And not only is it sort of a sort of precluding things like David Lynch's Blue Velvet, I also thought a lot of Sam Fuller's The Naked Kiss. Watching this.
Yeah, for sure.
Sam Fuller's The Naked Kiss, and here I would say much less of a direct influence, because I would not remotely say that the film I'm about to mention was influenced by Shadow of a Doubt, but an interesting similarity in terms of the period, which is Chaplin's Monsieur Verdoux, right? Which is also based on a real-life serial killer, a serial killer who, like the serial killer that Shadow of a Doubt was based on, I'm trying to remember his name. He was known as the Gorilla Man, who was a killer in the 1920s. Earl Nelson was sort of the loose basis for Uncle Charlie, in the same way that Ed Gein was the loose basis for Norman Bates in Psycho. But even in Monsieur Verdoux, you have this literal lady killer who ultimately kind of says, and it's not to another character, it's to a courtroom basically, but he's like, the world sucks, and people do terrible things all the time, and most of the people who have these terrible things who happen to them, kind of deserve it. And, I mean, that's sort of the substance of two of Uncle Charlie's speeches as well, right? He kind of passes the buck to the universe in terms of what he does. He says people are horrible. People are livestock, basically. And I love that line where he calls them fat, wheezing animals, because if you remember, Hitchcock famously said actors were basically cattle. You get a teeny little bit maybe of Hitchcock's misanthropy there. But that scene at the bar, where, as you put it, he just simply breaks the illusion. He's like, yeah, I straight up did that. So what? It is a break. it is a break, but it's also, for a terrible moment, it's almost like an invitation, right? Where he's like, I don't really like you snooping around me at the house and trying to find the newspaper that has my picture hidden on it that I'm trying to hide from you. I don't like you looking at all my stuff and this little emerald ring and, paying attention to what I'm whistling. So, like, I'm just going to tell you what I'm doing, and what are you going to do about it? And is this maybe a little interesting to you? Because there's a seductiveness about Uncle Charlie and a barely sublimated, incestuous kind of sexual element to the movie that is much better for being sublimated and subtle, but it's quite perverse. And he's taking her out for a drink, basically. And the bartender is very sexualized in that scene, too. Is she? I can't remember. I don't think she's a classmate of young Charlie, but you sort of get a sense that she's like a local girl.
Yeah,
they definitely know each other.
Charlie,
and she mentions that they kind of mentioned that Charlie has kind of taken him to kind of one of the seedier bars, because it's the one that she got a job at after being fired from 5 other ones.
That's right. Yeah, after being fired. So I mean, a bar is a very grown up space to take your teenage niece, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a form of a seduction or a bit of an initiation, or it's because it's a lot of things at once. Shadow of a Doubt is a movie that is a lot of things at once at a lot of different times. And it's also just straight up a challenge to her, right?
Yep.
In a different movie.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, well, what are you going to do? And the answer to that is quite troubling, which is, for a lot of the movie, I mean, I'm simplifying when I say this, but for a lot of the movie, she does nothing. I mean, she worries, Yeah. She worries, and she thinks about what to do, but she's not empowered in the same way that the boyfriend the movie contrives for her, this young this young investigator, this young detective. I mean, he in plot terms can kind of do something about it. She can't, and I think that is where that wonderful passivity that Hitchcock is great at comes in, where you are now just with someone watching something bad happening, thinking about that badness, thinking about their complicity in it, and having a really hard time acting, also because she doesn't want to fall out of love with this uncle.
I think the love is a really important part of that too, because I think a huge part of it actually, and a huge part of her passivity, is that Charlie, Uncle Charlie, he was very much willing to break that image in that sequence with her. She is much less willing to, it's a bit of a dark coming of age thing where she's being exposed to the darker things hiding underneath that surface. But at the same time, like, I think of that moment when, she does get Uncle Charlie closer to the end to leave, and he announces that he's leaving, and how heartbroken his sister is and Charlie's mother is. And Charlie watches her mother breaking down in this thing, and she knows that, on some level, by exposing Uncle Charlie, she will be the one actually breaking that picture perfect image. That in some ways, because Uncle Charlie can perform, because they sort of, it turns into a little bit of a game that Hitchcock kind of lets you in on, because both of them are they're deemed smart. They're the ones who can navigate this kind of hidden world just beneath the surface there, and they both put on performances at the dinner table. I love that. I think Adam just mentioned it, the one where he gets the big monologue where he breaks his facade very briefly at the dinner table with everyone. I love his sister's reaction too, which was basically like, well, don't say that in front of my women friends, because he goes on this giant misogynistic rant about all the sort of widows who are just eating away at their their husband's money that they spent a whole life working for, and he calls them fat wheezing animals. And then he says, not only that, what happens to animals when they get too fat and old. And Charlie, she's the only one who kind of knows what it is that he's saying, because they're kind of talking, Charlie's father at the table is constantly talking about like murder mysteries and like making up stories and things like that. So much of the family is kind of treating his monologue like that. She knows that he's basically admitting that he's a killer. And so she says, they're alive, they're human, aren't they? And Hitchcock, this amazing moment where it's a profile shot of him completely from young Charlie's point of view, looking at him at the dinner table. This slow zoom in on his face as he looks directly down the lens and says, "Are they?"
Yeah. I mean, thank God the movie's not more famous, or that would be a meme, right? Are they? But I mean, that's actually a moment too that is one of the few cases in an otherwise very evenly directed movie that he goes for a kind of stylistic brio. I mean, the Hitchcock of 1943 was established as a great filmmaker. He had won a Best Picture Oscar for Rebecca, and he was probably, in the handful of directors working both in the UK and then in the Hollywood system who people would know at that time as a director before the cult of auteurism was officially born. But he's not yet the exceptionally self-conscious Hitchcock of the late 40s and early 50s. And Shadow of a Doubt has such an efficient, humming, machine-like quality as a suspense film. I always find when I rewatch it, it's so evenly directed, it's not really a film of set pieces. If you compare it to something even like Strangers on a Train, which I think is a good comparison, not just because it ends on a train, but because Joseph Cotton's performance has a little bit of what Robert Walker did in Strangers on a Train. Walker's more flamboyant, but it's both these characters who are just completely open at certain times about how much they hate other people. Strangers on a Train is like a set-piece movie. It is a movie of spectacular choreography and camera movements and close-ups that play with perspective. There's a lot of really agile directing in Shadow of a Doubt. When I say it's evenly directed, I don't mean that it's indifferently directed, but it's not like one of those Hitchcock highlight reel movies. And there's nothing wrong with those movies, but that's, I think, kind of what's so unique about it, which is it's everything that's kind of amazing and mesmerizing about his filmmaking, but feels all completely in the service of the story and the characters. It doesn't step outside of it with that kind of showmanship he had later on. I don't know if that struck you when you watched it, but it's actually one of the things I really, really like about it.
Yeah, no, definitely, because I noticed that, there is sort of like this sort of baseline of the town, and he only ever gets into that sort of that style breaking when there is this idea of Charlie and Charlie kind of facing off kind of psychologically, and now really they aren't really doing anything necessarily. Like sometimes it's just a lot of young Charlie looking at him and being very concerned about the fact that he's a killer and what's he going to do next or something like that, but he'll get at that through like a a way to use the camera that signals that they are connected in this scene, despite there being so many other people involved in the scene. There will be like a moment where she looks down at him, and there will be sort of like a dolly push in on him in the distance, standing in like a doorway where he looks kind of creepy or imposing, because we're getting into her mind and what she's feeling about him. But really, he's standing in the doorway.
I really like
ultimately
the portrayal of her progression of being suspicious of Uncle Charlie. Like initially when they first meet, she sees a few things here and there, and she suspects that he's hiding something, but there's still like this innocence to her. Like as she's asking him initially what he's hiding, I'm going to find out your secret, she's got this big smile on her face. It's almost like there's a playfulness to it a little bit. And then as it progresses, it just gets darker and darker until the point where every time she sees Uncle Charlie, her giant smile that Teresa just has in her character just goes away. The innocence is gone. And I loved seeing that progression. It's saddening for sure.
Well, and when you talk about the way that they're focused on the scenes, kind of isolate the two of them as if they have an eyeline match or a secret understanding between them, that's paralleled with the absolute obliviousness of those characters, as you say, are just constantly talking about, here's how I would plot a perfect murder.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Here's how I'd murder my best friend.
Yeah, which is
all those characters exist in the "It's a Wonderful Life" version of this movie.
Yeah.
Well, they exist, but what they also exist is they exist in a kind of Hitchcock repertory that hadn't quite been invented yet, because this is before Rope, which is literally about let's talk about a murder, and it's before the talk. It's before the discussions in Strangers on a Train of trying to plot the perfect murder. I mean, it's a preamble to those later and in some ways more famous movies. And in this film, it's very innocent. It's like these people are talking about this because they would never do it. Right. And Uncle Charlie doesn't engage in the conversation because he's done it already. And it contextualizes the harm that we fear, and that as the movie goes on, we're right to fear that he's actually capable of doing to his niece. Because I would say the love in this movie does go two ways, right? I mean, if you're going to just call out the romantic or quasi-incestuous subtext between them, it's not just a young, impressionable girl with a kind of handsome, charming uncle. I mean, the movie very much, is focused on Teresa Wright's face and her body, no less than Francois Truffaut, when he interviewed Hitchcock, said, "Boy, she's got a pleasing shape, doesn't he?" He said that to Hitchcock, which is one thing if you're talking about, a grown-up actress like Grace Kelly, but I mean, Teresa Wright is playing a teenager.
Yeah, which also leads that FBI agent to be a pretty sus character himself.
He is a pretty sus character.
Yeah.
But when you counterbalance the incredible misogyny of the Uncle Charlie character that is all about the appearance of the women who he kills, right? Because he doesn't come out and say, the world's a crappy place and milkmen are assholes and your pastor is an asshole. He's like, these old ladies are the worst,
Right, yeah.
And some of what he seems to feel towards his own sister when he says, "Oh, once upon a time you were really pretty. You were the prettiest girl, you're not now." I mean, he doesn't say that. But there's a condescension to it when he's talking to his sister.
Absolutely.
He's clearly kind of fixated on his niece too. And that's where you get the kind of sexualized compulsion towards violence that Hitchcock, for whatever reason, not to imply anything or try to separate or disseparate art from artists, but he was really, really good and fascinated at that. at men wanting to kill women who have either offended some sense of theirs or who know something about them. I mean, you think about a movie like Strangers on a Train, the murder in the amusement park. It's one of the most sexualized murders I've ever seen in a movie, in terms of it just seeming to come straight from how much this man hates the kind of woman she is, much on top of, completely aside from the plot context for the murder. And there's some of that in Shadow of a Doubt too, for sure.
Yeah, that was my experience watching late Hitchcock. Very uncomfortable to watch something like Frenzy.
Frenzy, yeah.
Yeah, just horrible. Or Marnie too.
Oh, yeah,
very,
Marnie.
very horrible.
Or Marnie or Psycho. And again, it's not about psychoanalyzing Hitchcock. I mean, for one thing, there's a half dozen books that do that, and sometimes it's also kind of futile. But in Shadow of a Doubt, because it doesn't have some of the really ornate mid to late Hitchcock isms in it, and because it's not a very explicit movie, I mean, it's pretty well behaved. It's black and white, 1943. It's not overt in its violence. All that stuff really seems to belong to the character instead of the filmmaker. I think, and this is a weird way to say it has one of the more pure dramatic motors and dramatic senses of any Hitchcock movie. It's actually one of those movies where you don't have to fill in weird motivational exposition problems or plot holes, because on that level it's all so tight.
Yeah, well, and this was partially written, I read, by Thornton Wilder, right?
Yeah.
He's an American playwright, so that was where he got a lot of that kind of like small town Americana kind of aspect too. And I also noticed, because we talked with Peter Labuza about it recently too, that this was the first film he made after actually parting ways with Joan Harrison too, who wrote a lot of his thrillers. Because we just talked about Phantom Lady, which she ghost wrote.
Wilder will be interesting when we bridge to the Stepfather, for sure. But it is funny that it would be Thornton Wilder to write this, because of course Our Town, his play, is such a, I wouldn't call it unambiguous or unequivocal, but such an enduring celebration of the kind of small town ethos and sense of community that I wouldn't say Shadow of a Doubt repudiates, but it sort of says, boy, is it oblivious to the other things in the world.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And
I think about that scene where he like walks into the bank and like everyone's just having a normal day at the bank, and he walks in and he just starts yelling like embezzlement at him, and everyone turns and like, you can't just say that in a bank. He was like, even though it's a real thing that banks do, you can't say that. It's very offensive to the fabric of the community.
Well, you mentioned It's a Wonderful Life, and you think of the scene in the bank, and there where it's like, where's your money? It's in Bill's house and Fred's house, and in Shadow of a Doubt, it's a kind of more cynical variation on that idea. But I mean, also, and I don't know what you guys have to say about this, but the ending of the movie, not the action movie ending of the movie, which is pretty good, all the stuff on the train, but the final choice, which, to cite a movie that wouldn't be made for another 20 years, but kind of like to print the legend about Uncle Charlie and not say what he did. Yeah. Which is
it's a very active choice. I mean, I think it's a really important part of like explaining. Not even that has to be explained, but like again, it clarifies her being passive through so much of the film. I think because again, there's she's the only one who knows what her uncle is, and she feels so deeply for her uncle and for her family and its image that she doesn't want to destroy or expose that either. So it's a very sort of complex emotional core that young Charlie has to, and that Teresa has to capture as a performer.
Well,
and it is also what leads to all those suspenseful situations where she's both trying to, simultaneously, she's trying to investigate her uncle, she's trying to protect the immediate family who aren't sensing because of, maybe their naivety. They aren't sensing this kind of darkness that is sitting at the dinner table with them. But then also she needs to perform for the family and perform for her uncle all at the same time. And it creates all these kind of like small gestures of, his menace sort of lingering just, on the periphery where he's, again, sitting ominously in a doorway, or when those brief images where we get close-ups of his hands and he's clenching his fists, and all you can imagine is the implication being drawn of them strangling, some poor old woman, or the moments, again, where he gets suddenly angry and he lets the facade slip. I think that it's just so important that like Hitch really, he glides you through the house with this complex contradiction. And by the time you get to the end, as they go, he was this really terrible thing, and the whole town is kind of celebrating him in a way. Yeah. But,
would you think
she to let everyone know would be to destroy the entire community in her eyes.
Right, which is, also the point of that deeply profound political tract, The Dark Knight, by Christopher Nolan. But no, the movie that I actually think of, I mean, I mentioned Monsieur Verdoux, and I think that there is something to that, but to mention another, Titan, and throw another Titan in the ring for the mid-40s, I mean, you think about Orson Welles in The Stranger, right? Yes. Where you have this escaped Nazi who basically goes to this small town where he becomes like the center of attention and a raconteur, and in that movie, of course, everyone knows and suspects him of being a Nazi because he's Orson Welles and he's the best. He's so charming. The same way that Joseph Cotten is so charming in Shadow of a Doubt. And then those two characters would sort of meet again in The Third Man, later on. But I mean, in The Stranger, similarly, that theme, which is very pertinent, I think, to a pre- and post-fascist world in the mid-40s of, what does it mean to recognize evil? Does evil actually have to like come out and tell you that it is evil before you can kind of see it? And if a society, if our town, doesn't recognize that it's in its midst, I mean, what does it say about the people who live here? Is it that they're too good and pure and decent to contemplate that possibility, or are they too oblivious to recognize it, and even where it may be kind of festering within themselves? I find the end of Shadow of a Doubt so disturbing because she doesn't want to share this knowledge, as you say, because she thinks it's going to kind of ruin everyone's life. But I mean, it may also be, to some extent, her boyfriend notwithstanding, she kind of likes keeping a secret.
Yeah, and it does feel like, even though the truth to the rest of the neighborhood and the family isn't actually totally revealed, they do have that moment where the mother gets in the car after Charlie is almost killed, and she says, like, I just don't understand, first the stairs. And so she's starting to put something together where something is off, and even though she never gets to the conclusion, it does still leave you with the thought that the neighborhood has some subconscious thoughts on what happened, regardless of what they may really think.
Well, yeah, and just two more little things for your listeners that are fun to think about before I guess we migrate to the Stepfather. Santa Rosa is a very similar backdrop to where the first version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers is set. The similar idea of kind of insidious evil in a kind of small California town in that midst. Mm-hmm. And it's also where the Coens set The Man Who Wasn't There as one of its many kind of implicit noir references. And while Man Who Wasn't There is absolutely much more about Double Indemnity and Postman Always Rings Twice and certain other films, I've always found the specific decision to set it where Shadow of a Doubt is set really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and too, as we are wrapping up, too, one thing I really wanted to say too is I really love the when this becomes more of kind of like, it feels like it's about to go murder mystery mode on us, because Uncle Charlie, the back like probably quarter of it is a lot of Uncle Charlie trying to kill young Charlie, but all through implication. And this was some of my favorite stuff that I've actually seen in a Hitchcock film, was just, again, young Charlie, as we've kind of established, being aware of kind of the second plane of existence. And I think it's really important too that, she is made as much of kind of like, even though that she chooses to be passive, there is, she is the active agent. A lot of this is from her point of view, as she is, the house, the sort of picture perfect domestic normalcy is literally being like weaponized against her, as she, he's like messing with little steps so that she might trip and fall down the stairs and maybe die.
Yeah. And it's a great callback to when the father is talking with his friend and he says like, I'd murder you so it didn't look like murder. It's just such a fun little connection to all those conversations.
Well, yeah, that's the comedy that I was kind of alluding to at the beginning, where because of the counterpoint of all this hypothetical murder, you're like, who needs to pay more attention to this, young Charlie or old Charlie? Because these are some pretty good tips.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love the one friend, Herb, where he's just like, well, I guess I couldn't really frame it as a suicide if I beat you to death with a crowbar.
Yeah, which is a good line.
A great part too when the mother, as an excuse to Charlie, because she gets really upset about all the murder talk because she knows what's going on with the uncle and all that, where she just goes, "That's just how your father relaxes. That's just he just talks about murdering his friend." It's a fantastic line. I loved that.
You know who also does that? You know who also does that is Woody Allen.
Oh yeah.
There was when Irrational Man came out, he said, "I spend my time, thinking of the perfect murder." Alfred Hitchcock and Woody Allen both love movies where people talk about murder hypothetically. Go talk to your psychiatrist as to why.
Definitely.
Yeah, I just really loved how, because again, the way that Hitchcock gets a little bit more stylized in his filmmaking, as he's acknowledging kind of like this world that these two are maneuvering, and it's, I found it just really engaging watching her, having to make decisions and, sort of pulling in this information. And then also the way that, frequently it can often be, sort of like heightened by the style, by, sort of, all of a sudden a simple gesture like her uncle going up the stairs after his name has been cleared because they found who they think is the killer on the other side of the country, despite the fact that he has already straight up admitted that he is the killer. And that's so fascinating, is that technically if young Charlie never learned that, there might have been nothing wrong. He might have just played the kind domestic uncle for a little while. And there would have been nothing going on there. But then she goes, he got away with it and I know. So the drama becomes she knows too much. He has to kill her. And again, a simple gesture like Uncle Charlie just running up the stairs will trigger this sense of like imbalance, and there will be like this low angle shot of him at the top of the stairs, feeling imposing or powerful. Or when after he does his monologue and she runs away terrified because, he's straight up just saying, I'm the killer in front of the family without anyone but her noticing. There's like a sudden tracking shot that like breaks from the table as Uncle Charlie starts like chasing her down. That's really horrifying. And it's very interesting how he gets into the space of both of these characters are the only two psychologically aware of all of this sort of game that's happening between the two of them. And he captures it all through visual language. None of them really speak any of this to each other. And it leads to some really horrifying results, like her almost being murdered in the garage, which is just a really horrifying sequence with all that, smoke coming out of it and following the logistics of him trying to get away with it once again, him going inside and like turning the music up so that the family can't hear her screaming in the backyard, that kind of stuff. It's just really horrifying details like that really set this over the top for me.
Yeah, which again is all about these little motifs or these little variations on like concealment and repression and tamping things down and quietude, which is why again that scene in the bar, the two shot in the bar is like almost the exact middle of the movie. It's almost like the kind of the crossover from the movie where everything is repressed and the movie where even if it's not in the open to everyone else, we in the audience have no more ambiguity about what's going on. And it's a pretty exhilarating and creepy second half for sure.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, pivoting towards a reductive rating round on Shadow of a Doubt, which for you, Adams, we remove all the words, all the nuance, give the movie a rating between 1 and 5, but it's also turned into closing statements and any lines or scenes that we maybe just didn't happen to get to that you want to bring up here at the end. And usually I go first, but I'm actually going to let you and Jamie go first because I'm actually on the fence on my rating on this one. This is my second time watching it.
I will just say... I'll give it a 4 out of 5. I think this was really strong. I really, really enjoyed it. I think this is my... I haven't watched a lot of Hitchcock, honestly, but this is
like your 4th or 5th, probably?
4th or 5th, I think. And I got to say, I mean, it's not a hot take, but he's an amazing filmmaker. I love the line. I just will mention this before I wrap it up totally. I love that line when he's letting Charlie know everything that he's been doing. He's basically revealing himself as the villain, as the killer. And he says, "You live in a dream, you're a sleepwalker." And it's just, I really like that line to express her kind of innocence and kind of her awakening after he exposes himself. Mm-hmm. So, it's just, this was awesome. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that and the follow-up line, too. Do you know if you rip off the fronts of the houses, you'd find swine?
Oh, yeah. God damn.
He's got away with his words, for sure.
But yeah, strong 4
for you, Adam.
It's a 5.
Nice.
I would put it on the short list of my favorite Hitchcocks. I think that it's I think it's a pretty much flawless space that it operates in, and I'm particularly sympathetic. Well, not sympathetic to it, but I'm particularly affectionate towards it because it exists in a subtler register than some of Hitchcock's other stuff. That is in no way a criticism of that other stuff. There's a reason that movies like Psycho and Vertigo and Strangers of a Train are part of the lexicon of popular filmmaking, where they get remade and ripped off and reconfigured for decades. What I kind of like about Shadow of a Doubt is how self-contained and small it is. It doesn't feel like a Hitchcock film that belongs to the whole world all the time. you can feel, even in the context of a world-famous filmmaker like Hitchcock, like you are having something of a self-contained private experience while watching it, instead of sharing it with everybody through osmosis, the second you see 2 seconds of it.
Hell yeah. Well, I think I've been convinced. I think I'm going to be going up to the 5 on it. This was my second or maybe even my third watch on it. And previously this was always kind of like more in the second tier of Hitchcock films for me. But on this watch, something really did just click for me more watching this. So I'm going to go with the 5 on this one. And I think a huge part of that is once again, we talked about how, there's this, I think Hitchcock said it was his favorite movie because he loved so much the idea of just the basic idea of bringing menace into a small town, bringing it into a picturesque kind of surface and sort of investigating the kind of ugly sickness underneath it. And not only that, but how those two things can kind of coexist. We're going to be talking about it in Rear Window next week, but there's something about how you indulge the thrill and you critique the thrill in similar ways. And I feel like that's something he gets at with the young Charlie character, which is that, she has these, this skill, she has this ability, she has this power that she shares with her uncle, and it both thrills her because she is playing a game that she's playing a game for adults, it's to say, but at the same time she wonders if that also makes her a sick and a lonely person in a similar way, that she's kind of, and I feel like the way that it gets into that character and the way that Wright performs it especially really clicked for me on this watch. And then especially the way that he literally weaponizes the house as a murder tool against her in that final part, and her also wrestling with not wanting to shatter that image. I was really struck by her watching her mom break down because she's sending her uncle away, and being like, this should be this sort of dramatically, that moment is a relief moment. It's like, she's found the ring, she has a way to expose him, and she's telling him that, and so she's won the sort of like the suspense game that we've been watching unfold, and that moment is nothing but sadness, just because even by sending him away, she's just harming everything that she previously believed in before her uncle shattered that for her. And I think that emotional experience gets across really well in the film.
Yeah.
But that being said, I think that is going to wrap it up for Shadow of a Doubt. We are going to be right back, and we're going to be talking about The Stepfather.
Good boy. Your daddy's little angel. Hi, honey.
He's just some crazy creep. Don't you talk to your father that way. He's not my father. How can you even bear to let him touch you? Stop it!
We have to talk, honey.
About what?
About what is happening to our family.
I'm taking care of it.
He scares me, Dr. Pondering.
Who am I here?
Help me! Help!
You're a very bad girl.
The Stepfather.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about The Stepfather, the 1987 American psychological thriller film directed by Joseph Rubin. The film very broadly stars Terry O'Quinn as a character named Jerry Blake, this sort of like seemingly mild-mannered sort of working father who may or may not just murder entire families. But before he does that, he quickly adopts new identities in other towns and leaves town and sets up a new life. And I think it's all kind of perfectly captured in the opening sequence of this film, which opens with like a great little creepy sort of jingly, almost like Danny Elfman sounding kind of synth score to it.
For sure.
As this sort of like bloody bearded man walks into a bathroom, he starts stripping, putting his clothes into a suitcase, and he showers and he shaves. He comes out, he's a completely different guy. And what does he do? Walks downstairs to the house and to this sort of like wide shot that kind of like pulls out of the house to reveal everything that's happening inside, and it is just an absolute massacre of kind of like blood and bodies and a dead little girl holding like a stuffed bear. It's a really shocking image, followed by a tracking shot that takes you away from the massacre and into the suburbs. And it really does set kind of like the contradiction that we're going to be experiencing watching this film, which is something similar to Shadow of a Doubt, which is again this kind of picturesque American suburbia and the sort of more dark, seedy, kind of upsetting things that kind of are can be lingering underneath them.
A few things about that opening scene. I mean, for one, Rubin is doing Hitchcock even before the movie starts properly, because we get a camera floating through the window. It's the same opening shot as Psycho, right? Right. You know, not going into a hotel window for a tryst, but, you know, to seeing, Terry O'Quinn showering. The moment when he walks out of the house and he's whistling Camptown Races evokes Shadow of a Doubt with the whistling of the Merry Widow, and also M with Peter Lorre singing in the Hall of the Mountain King. So this idea of a serial killer with a kind of theme song. I mean, it's even like Jaws. You know, the shark has his music. There's the script for the film is by Donald Westlake, who wrote the Parker novels, and I don't know how much you've read the Parker novels, but there's one called The Man with the Getaway Face, which is like a perfect encapsulation of what O'Quinn is doing at that beginning, you know, kind of trading one face for another. He's not disguising his identity. He's just, you know, changing into a more, an even more clean-cut, you know, version of himself and passing completely unnoticed. And strangely, the opening of the film, and you guys may find this a stretch, and it's not intentional, it has always reminded me of the beginning of The Terminator, with the naked Arnold, you know, kind of getting dressed, reinventing himself, and kind of walking off in the world to do harm.
Yeah, he does kind of have that kind of sort of like obsessive, sort of like on a mission kind of aspect to him.
Well, I think that he's a very kind of genteel dad bod Terminator, you know, and what's at stake is not the rise of the machines, but what's at stake is, and this is where the screenplay for the film is fairly blunt, but, you know, what's at stake is the American dream, not as it exists for anybody except for him, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because Uncle Charlie doesn't believe at all in the accoutrements or the trappings of polite American society, whereas Jerry Blake seems to believe in them to a homicidal extent, and he can only control them kind of under his own roof. Mm-hmm. That's where The Stepfather is a lot like Shadow of a Doubt, where all the menace in the movie, and actually all the murders, are very much about like houses and domestic spaces, and so you're not safe at home. Like, it's very much a movie made after Halloween in that sense too.
Yeah,
but I mean,
that's a big point of reference, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, in Halloween, you know, Michael Myers is other and wears a mask, and the dads are just kind of ineffectual. And here it's like the dad is Michael Myers, or the dad is the Terminator. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit like a trashy 80s version of Bigger Than Life, you know, where James Mason knows better. But except that James Mason is being, you know, driven crazy by cortisone, and Terry O'Quinn in this movie is just kind of driven crazy by America. You know, he's driven crazy by Father Knows Best. And the script is not subtle on those points, but I actually like how hard it hits them, because in a cheap little piece of exploitation pulp, which is really bloody and gory and has completely unnecessary nudity and all of that stuff, you kind of like when it hits the thematic nail on the head like that. Like, I love when he's with his new family and sort of meeting the whole town has kind of come out to meet him the way they do Uncle Charlie in Shadow of a Doubt. He's like, call me corny, but I believe in the American dream. And you're just watching this being like, yeah, you do. And, you know, you're going to kill everybody to, you know, you're going to kill everybody to get it. And again, subtlety in that case is overrated.
Yeah, well, and I love too that he's a real estate agent too, selling the entire neighborhood their houses as well. Like he's literally selling people the idea. You know, kids. That's what he says too. He says, "I'm selling people not their homes, but the American dream themselves." He wants to participate in the society, but at the same time, you know, there are kind of complications to it, and it seems like that is what kind of upsets him, is when there is a family dynamic that isn't meant for a postcard. if there is, a death in the family and there's a grieving wife and there's a grieving daughter, and that strains the relationship, which is what happens, to his new stepfamily that he has. This, really upsets him, the idea that I think she gets expelled from school because she gets into fights at school, and his line is, "Girls don't get expelled from school," or whatever it is, But so it's like it's one of those things where he's trying to impose. It's a different thing where he's trying to impose the picturesque quality, and he will do it violently in order to achieve that postcard family.
Well, he will, and what trips him up in this movie, and it's again interestingly tied to Shadow of a Doubt, is I think the kind of sexual awakening of the teenage daughter in this case, played by Jill Sholin, where here it's not at all an attraction towards her stepfather. I mean, in that sense, it's different than Shadow of a Doubt. She never likes him. Right? She doesn't like him from the beginning. She
even
sees through
suspects him like from the very beginning. It seems.
She suspects from the start. But what frustrates her about him is that she's a little unruly, and she has this difficulty, and she's not over her father. But he also seems just driven absolutely mad by the fact of her sexuality. It just really seems to bother him, right? He wants to infantilize her and relate to her and treat her like a little girl, because her being a kind of pert, full to bursting teenager really undermines this kind of old-fashioned authority. I love the idea that he's kind of like a guy from the 50s who ends up in an 80s movie. It's kind of like cheesy music, and like, again, a really kind of luridly faux Hitchcockian shower scene, because the stepfather wears its references all over the place. And so there's that scene at the end after he's hit Shelley Hack's character with the phone receiver, and he's having one of his little breakdowns, and Stephanie just comes home to take a shower, and you're like, movie, you're so gross.
It's so unnecessary.
This is so unnecessary. I mean, there's a level on which is any shower scene unnecessary, but I mean, it is. It's just incredibly prurient and sort of piling on, but it does cinch the link, I think, between what it is subconsciously that is driving him kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I when it comes to her sexuality, I think of like that goodnight kiss that the boy at school gives, and he runs out the door and accuses the guy of rape. He's like, she's only 16 years old, and I love his reaction. He's like, so am I? So am I. Now here's the $64,000 question. Really, the secret center of this whole podcast. Do you guys notice the poster for Our Town on her wall? I did not notice that.
I didn't know.
Yeah, in her childhood room, she's got all kinds of cool 80s stuff. Like, she's listening, I think, to The Unforgettable Fire by U2. And there's some other kind of 80s pinup. But there's a poster for a production of Our Town on her wall. And that's where some of the little... So yeah, Thornton Wilder, which is where some of, again, that self-conscious or that elusive quality that the movie has really starts to come into focus with regard to Shadow of a Doubt, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, these are not deep core significant things. They're kind of just like little spot thing. They're like, where's Waldo jokes. But I think that's a pretty good one in terms of what Joseph Rubin and Westlake are kind of working towards. I love the idea of a movie that is just straight up ugly pulp, but that's pretty smart and clever and sardonic about it. And so like the little Thornton Wilder poster on her wall is a pretty good skeleton key to unlocking kind of why I think this movie's kind of better than it actually is. Because there's like the level on which it's not great.
Yeah, I think the main thing that kind of hurt this one for me is that it just, I mean, I don't think it's not something that, it necessarily has to do, but it doesn't quite have that same dynamic that I loved so much from Shadow of a Doubt, like comparing the two, that of the two figures kind of maneuvering and playing each other and kind of like the wits and the tension of it, because there's a beginning part where she starts to suspect him, and there is actually a great little sequence where she mails a reporter to find a photo of the killer, and the reporter sends the photo to her in the mail being like, this is the guy who previously killed his family. Does this look like your dad? And there is a scene that they rip straight from Shadow of a Doubt where he goes to the mailbox and grabs the mail and sees it, and he bugs out as soon as he sees that it's his photo in the thing, and he gets the mail first, and he gives her the Cosmopolitan magazine. And it's very similar to the scene where Uncle Charlie grabs the newspaper and he starts ripping up the newspaper with his story in it, except for that young Charlie actually catches that because she's on the same level as him in many different ways. And what's interesting is that he slips a different photo into the actual mail that she receives, and she goes, oh, so it's not him. And then it basically drops that for the rest of the movie, and then it's replaced with a more kind of a little bit more of of the time kind of generic slasher trajectory. Or it's not bad. It's still frequently like stylish and tense and everything like that. But the plotting just gets a little bit more generic because she's not going Nancy Drew mode anymore. You don't really get those amazing scenes where they're both on each other's wavelength, or even she is identifying with him, or she's worried or concerned about him, even though he does do some psycho stuff. Like when Terry O'Quinn goes breakdown mode in the scenes where he thinks he's alone, he's freaking out.
Oh yeah.
But she only sees that once, and then immediately, she's just like, oh, whatever. That wasn't very much. It's fine.
I also love that moment with her when she's with her friend, because she gets that picture, and it's revealed that he couldn't possibly be the killer because this is the picture she received. And the friend says something along the lines of, well, why are you disappointed? That means your stepfather isn't Jack the Ripper. And it reminded me
of Rear Window.
Yeah, exactly. Just the fact that it's like she was almost hoping that this man that she already didn't like is Jack the Ripper, so that he can get out of her family, even if it would mean that he's a psychopathic murderer. It's a very funny little callback.
Well, it's a movie that in the back half, and it really does conform to that Roger Ebert idea of the idiot plot. Where a lot of characters really are pretty dim or pretty slow or pretty unlucky to just mechanically contrive everything that happens in the last 30 minutes.
I felt really bad because I spent the whole movie thinking that eventually she was going to team up with the young brother-in-law of the previous family.
Yeah.
Because there's a whole subplot where he's investigating the guy, and he's uncovering the information. You thought that they would, I thought that they were going to, join forces, and they were going to, try to reach the same conclusions at the same time.
He's Scatman Crothers in The Shining.
Yeah, he literally shows up to deliver a gun to the final.
That's what I was just going to say. When that happened, I was a little bit, I will say, disappointed, just because they spend a decent amount of time with the guy. It's mostly based on the daughter and the stepfather, but there's still enough of him that I thought he would turn into some type of significant character. But no, he's just to deliver the gun.
He literally shows up at the house. He gets gutted immediately, drops the gun so that there's a gun added into the climactic set piece. Like, that's literally his entire purpose. And that kind of writing, unfortunately, there's just no way it can be as interesting as the bits where we get to see Wright perform at the dinner table, like the domestic happy daughter, knowing 100% that her uncle is a killer sitting right next to her. There's just nothing quite as tense as that going on.
But in the midst of all that machine... Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I also really enjoyed another intriguing part that's just better than that kind of subplot with the one guy that brings the gun, is that the part where it unveils that Jerry's wearing a toupee, and then he puts together another getup and goes to another home and starts to start a different family with somebody else that's single. Those are all the moments I was really intrigued with. Yeah, and I felt just distracted by the other subplot for whatever reason they threw in there.
But what I love is these little moments of a kind of a sublime, not even trashiness, but kind of just a sublime creepiness in the midst of all the machinery. I mean, the reason I love The Stepfather, I don't know how personal people get on the show, or not personal. This isn't personal. I'm not going to say I am the stepfather. I'm just going to say I'm just remembering watching it as a kid.
Yeah,
it's when Terry O'Quinn is in the scene in the kitchen with Shelley Hack, Susan, who's sort of like Lolita's mom in Lolita. She's kind of like, again, with Humbert marrying her to get to the daughter, there's an element of that, but she's kind of oblivious, nice lady.
Yeah.
And you know, very nice to Jerry, but she's kind of just be there to not get what her husband's really up to. And when she finally laboriously is like, I called your work and they say you weren't there, and where have you been, and you're crazy, you know, and he tries to explain away, and he gives himself the wrong name. You know, he calls himself by one of his other alter egos. And he has this one little line, which they ended up putting on the poster, where he just says, "Who am I here?" And
he says, "Wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
Which version of myself am I?" Yeah.
And when I was however old I was when I saw that movie, because this was one of those things I used to rent from a store called Video on Bayview at Merton in Toronto, which is now gone. The strip mall is something else, and this guy used to rent me restricted movies all the time. This guy Anthony, he's sort of like the epicenter of me seeing movies I shouldn't have seen when I was 10 or 11.
Yeah.
That line reading just scared the absolute shit out of me.
Yeah, that's a really great line, and it reminds me of that kind of perverse joke that Nolan threw in Memento of the "I'm chasing this guy."
Yeah.
Oh no,
wait,
he's chasing me. Yeah.
Because I think and the movie was very well reviewed. I mean, Pauline Kael famously loved it. You know, one of the times she got something right, she really liked The Stepfather, and his performance kind of made him a star. You know, it's funny to think that like a little B movie, you know, film that made like about $3 million at the box office in 1987 could kind of make someone a star. But he really leveraged this into a lot of steady work. He's quite brilliant in this film.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, really good.
And it's not a subtle performance, but he's scary and funny, and he looks right, and there's a creepiness to the way that he hit the identity shifting played at the time off of like what people were reading and learning about killers like Ted Bundy, you know?
Yep.
But it comes out around the same time as Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, and in Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, the Michael Rooker character just is who he is. He doesn't pretend anything. He just kind of like leads with who he is, and he's just cutting this swath of carnage through mostly rural sort of run-down spaces. And The Stepfather, it's just very insidious. He's just as savage as Henry is, or as Michael Myers is. But that idea that he can pass for kind of lame, and pass for nerdy, and pass in a way for like a character out of the 50s, like the return of the 50s repressed. It's so aligned with a political moment of Reaganism and Morning of America and what's hidden in there. I think a great double bill from that same year or close to that same year would be to watch this at the same time as They Live, which I'm sure is a movie you've done on this show.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, we have. Such a good one.
They interestingly kind of go well together. One is sci-fi and one is a psychological thriller, but they're both just very much about surfaces, I think.
Yeah, another really cool parallel scene with Shadow of a Doubt and The Stepfather is when they're having the barbecue and like the pool party or whatever, and it's the same scene where Uncle Charlie and Shadow of a Doubt is going off about the old women and how, you know, they're not necessarily viewed as humans in his eyes and all that, and The Stepfather in his version in the barbecue reveals himself briefly, but no one really, you know, pays attention to it. And he just says, they're like, how could somebody do that? How could somebody kill their entire family? And he just
because they're reading the newspaper of the previous family that's been killed, right?
Yeah. And he just calmly responds with, maybe they disappointed him. And that's just, it's such a great line.
Psycho answer.
And it doesn't quite have the same punch, just because with Shadow of a Doubt you have Charlie in the scene as well that knows what's going on, and with that scene in The Stepfather it's more so for the audience member, like just the person sitting and watching the film, but it's still a really good parallel, and I loved that moment.
The most effective stretch for me, honestly, was when the psychiatrist started trying to investigate him.
Oh yeah.
Because the daughter is seeing a psychiatrist and talking about him.
Well, that's the most Hitchcockian passage, right?
Yeah. Well, especially too because it's the one where there is, you know, the psychiatrist kind of has some idea that, you know, he's trying to investigate the stepfather because hearing enough stories from the daughter in their therapy sessions has gotten him interested, and he kind of and the stepfather avoids him. He won't set up an appointment, you know, to just talk with him as like, you know, psychiatrist to, you know, stepfather to talk about the daughter's therapy sessions. So he sets up, you know, a house meeting with him where he's going to go take a look at a house. He might buy a house. And there's sort of this unspoken investigation happening as he's kind of probing him with questions, and the stepfather starts to realize that he's being probed and he doesn't like that, and it's where he breaks that facade with him and straight up just kills him with a 2x4, like right there, and then takes him out to like the back, and he like blows up his car and everything like that. And the real cherry on top to this sequence is that he eventually goes back to the house, to the daughter, into the garage, and he makes his way back in, and he reports, he's just like, I'm so sorry to talk to you and tell you this information, like, about your psychiatrist. It's just one of those things that happened. He ran off the road and he died. And there's such this perverse moment where he says it so, like, almost affectless, and he hugs her. And she is, expressing so much real emotional pain about this. And obviously she has no idea that, he could possibly be behind it. And so there is a little bit of tension in that moment where, he's holding her.
And smiling.
And he uses completely aware of how he's just manipulated the entire, environment.
You're forgetting the great line there, which was also in the trailer, which is he puts the corpse in the car and says, "Buckle up."
Yes, for safety.
Which is again one of like,
and then whistles off again. Yeah,
and then whistles off again, because there's these moments again where it's hitting it very, very unsubtly. I think at one point he actually says, "Father knows best," and you can see the exploitation movie trailer being sort of cut around that.
Yeah, for sure.
They like it's not an austere film in that sense. Mm-hmm. But that scene, the murder with the 2x4, is great, not just because it's a good gory 2x4 murder, but because it's in a house, right?
Yeah.
And I love you have that opening
with a piece
scene
of the house, even
with a piece of the
that
house.
he's like selling the American dream with. It's great.
Yeah,
and
then you get the psycho disposing of the body scene a little bit there too, as he's dumping it, and
the psycho body disposal. But I mean, all the little, and Hitchcock would call them, I mean, they're not MacGuffins because they're not things that drive the plot, but all the little touches, in the same way Shadow of a Doubt's got a bunch of them, like the newspaper and the emerald ring. I love some of the things in the Stepfather. Like, I love the birdhouse,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, symbolically, cut down at the end of the movies. You have to be like, I never liked you anyway, Stepfather. I mean, it's very kind of, very, very pat little ending, and very weird kind of pairing with Blue Velvet at the end. I mean, Blue Velvet, you have the return of the robins, and the robin with the bird in his beak, and that, the birds and cycle of life go on. And the end of the Stepfather is just like, cut down this birdhouse that I made with my crazy not dad. But it's
moving forward.
But even the last line he has, where he says to her, "I love you," and you sort of go, "Did you?" I mean, you didn't. You. But I'm not making fun of the movie when I say that. I'm saying it's really kind of creepy, because this is a guy who loves the idea of these things, but he has no actual love for people, and all people do to him the second he meets them and talks to them is they disappoint him. And I mean, a movie like The Shining is way more poetically about this kind of male rage and the rage of being at the head of the household, and you like the idea of a wife and kid, but you don't like the way that they actually act, right? Because kids are annoying, and sharing your space with another person is annoying. And that one way of looking at the film is as a very perverse satire of male commitment phobia. Except here, it's not someone who's afraid of becoming a husband and father. It's that he wants to do it so much.
But it needs to be perfect. It needs to be his version of perfect.
His version of perfect, which again, it ties it to something like Bigger Than Life, and ties it to this kind of swelled, outside, controlling male ego, which a lot of horror movies don't necessarily take that as their subject. I mean, it's very...
It eventually explodes into a slasher set piece where he's like, "Come to daddy, Stephanie."
Which again is much less chilling than that opening scene, which is one of, as you guys alluded to it, I mean, it is a terrifying scene.
Oh, horrifying.
Yeah. And just to linger on that, like the child's lifeless body right before it cuts to the neighborhood again. Horrible, it's like, damn, like, very, very
so it gets cheesier as it goes on, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't think the cheesiness sells out or undermines what the movie is actually about. It actually kind of maybe makes it so that you can kind of take it. Whereas a more realistic film, like a movie like The Stepfather, made like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer or something, would probably be, would be unbearable.
Yeah, that'd be stomach churning for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, and we'll say too, even though it goes kind of generic slasher a little bit in its final reel there, like there is some cool sequencing, like him breaking through the mirror through the door, trying to like get her in the bathroom, or going up into the attic where you get kind of like that blue directional lighting kind of hitting him. I love the small comedic detail where she like literally like hurls a sled at him while he's trying to like come up the top of the attic and stuff like that. And I do like the final gesture too, where, you know, she stabs him and he says, "I love you." And he does go full Terminator mode too, where the mom gets the gun and starts like shooting him in the legs, and he's like falling down the stairs, but that won't stop him. He's going to keep going up. He's going to get his daughter. And I love the detail too, that she just stabs him right in the heart.
Yeah.
Very specifically, as he's, you know, saying, "I love you," and then, you know, rolls down the steps and dies there. And symbolically, she takes down the birdhouses that he was always building in the tool shed and things like that, where he was going kind of psycho mode and things like that. But pivoting towards the reductive rating round here on The Stepfather. The Stepfather, I think, gets a high 3 from me. I think mostly because I was, maybe it's unfair too, but mostly just because I was comparing it to Shadow of a Doubt. I was less taken with, you know, how it doesn't make the daughter as much of an active player in the suspense sequencing that takes place. Actually, she completely kind of forgets about everything that she previously thought about him for a good portion of the movie, until it kind of does go kind of like Halloween mode on him. But there is some really effective tense sequences, especially because this is, again, more from the point of view as well of the stepfather and the killer, more than it is you know, sort of like the young girl kind of like wrestling with that. And I think it also really does walk well that line of the picturesque domesticity. I love that. I looked up the cinematographer and saw that he went on to like mostly shoot like bright looking like rom-coms. It kind of gives the movie this nice kind of like surface shine to it. Lots of smiles and sweater vests and like perfect green lawns and white trimming and all of that, before, you know, it gets into the realm of like a full out slasher film. Well, and so even if it misses, you know, some of the qualities that I liked from Shadow of a Doubt, like the kind of that tension of that undercurrent of that feeling in the visual language of, you know, that dark underbelly. I do think that you know, despite not quite seeing the contradictions wrestled with, you know, as much in the family, it's mostly with the killer. I do think that there is something happening here, and something shocking that does take place, just the contradiction of those two kind of images that are taking place in the film. And I did actually think of Halloween as kind of like a reference point, even though Halloween, I think, actually maybe even gets a little bit closer to capturing that feeling of that undercurrent quality of dread and seeing it and feeling it before it actually reaches out to you and tries to kill you. We talked about on our Halloween episode how much Jamie Lee Curtis is like the only one who senses that there's something kind of wrong going on here. But, you know, I had a good time with it, and I saw a lot of people kind of calling it kind of like the Lifetime version of like a slasher film or something like that. But it is more psychologically engaging than calling it just that, and it is a great little sort of autumn horror movie slasher. And O'Quinn, I think a huge part of it is O'Quinn's performance.
Yeah, he's unbelievably good in that.
He's very good.
You mentioned John Lindley, and, you know, we should say he shot Field of Dreams, which is a dad classic.
Yes.
And Father of the Bride, which is a dad classic. Yeah. And Pleasantville, which is a small town classic. And Stepfather is quite beautifully shot. The rating I'm going to give it, if I can give it a rating, is it's probably a 3 in reality, but it's like a 4.5 for me personally.
Yeah.
So you can average those two things, because I just associate it with those wonderful, slightly clandestine memories of you know, going to the video store and taking something home based on the box art, which a million people have their own versions of that story, but it was a movie that I encountered, you know, not out of a book or not seeing it with my family or on television or later in life, where you can go through and find all kinds of, as you guys would call them, you know, Sleazoid films. It was a very pure experience of, I'm going to rent this movie because of the box, because it looks violent, and I'm going to watch it without telling my parents. And it's just very embedded and impressed upon my memory in that sense. So, I mean, watching it again on YouTube, it's about a 3-star movie. but the memories of it are priceless.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. For you, Jamie.
I would also give it the high 3 out of 5 for now. Honestly, I think I might revisit it though, because I did have a lot of fun with it. The moment where he kind of breaks down his identity in the kitchen right before he reveals to his wife that who he is, I think is really, really good. And I honestly would have liked a little bit more with him balancing his different identities, because we don't get too much of it, but I would have been interested in seeing him interact with that family he was starting to manipulate a little bit more before he started to break down his identity. I think that was just a very interesting part of the film. But that being said, it's a lot of fun. O'Quinn is incredible in it, really, really good. And I think I'm going to revisit this one. But for now, it's the high 3. Really good time.
Stepfather web series when? You know?
There you go.
Yeah.
Or a Quibi Stepfather series.
We need it. It'll happen, let's be honest.
I think that will wrap it up for everything this week. That was Shadow of a Doubt, 1943, and The Stepfather from 1987. Thanks so much, Adam, for joining us and for bringing these films with you. Before you head out here, this is the part of the show where if you've got anything coming up that you want to plug, you can do it right here.
Well, it may or may not have been announced at this point on social media, but what the hell? I've got another book coming out similar to the ones that I've done for Abrams on Paul Thomas Anderson and the Coens. As you can guess, it's an illustrated critical study of Jason Reitman, a really just terrific filmmaker whose career owes nothing to nepotism, just a visual virtuoso. No one will ever forget films like Up in the Air and Tully. No, I wrote a book on David Fincher, which Abrams will be putting out. Just in time to ride the Mank backlash. But a semi-deserved backlash in that case. But yeah, I've got a book coming out on David Fincher. You can always find, or lucky to say, you can always find my film writing in The Ringer and CinemaScope. And as far as what's coming up, I'm just going to stay in my picture perfect home with my kids. Just,
that's right.
You're not gonna become the stepfather.
No, the Joker meme with "I'm going to become the stepfather" is just not quite famous enough to do it. But I hope not, because
we'll make it happen.
The schools are open again, so no, I'll just be here. I'll just be here, hanging out and listening to this and thanking you guys for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. This was great.
All right. Well, for our listeners, we're going to be back in 1 week's time with your guys' bonus episode, where sort of bouncing off of Adam's double feature where he did here, where we did kind of Hitchcock and then an 80s sort of slasher update on Hitchcock. We are going to be talking about perhaps you've heard of it, Rear Window from 1954 by Alfred Hitchcock. We're going to be talking about voyeurism and feeling trapped in your apartment and bored as hell and wanting to just do nothing but watch screens and engage in stories. Something no one is feeling right now, I'm sure.
No.
So we're going to be talking about Rear Window, and we're going to be pairing it with Joe Dante's The Burbs. Yes. From 1980. I didn't double check. Maybe 8, 9.
I think it's 89.
We're going to be talking about The Burbs, which stars Tom Hanks and is kind of Joe Dante's kind of absurd slapstick update
very
on
wacky.
Rear Window, which is a lot of fun.
Yep.
So that's what you can expect for next week's bonus episode. Again, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. And then in 1 week's time, we're going to be back with a friend of the show making, I think, his third appearance as a guest on the show, Perry Rulland.
Hell yeah.
And he is going to be bringing with him a gory double feature, from what I understand, of Mermaid in a Manhole and House with the Laughing Windows.
Great titles.
Haven't seen any of these, know nothing about them, except for that Mermaid in a Manhole is the 6th movie in what is called the guinea pig movies. Mm-hmm. And every single one of the guinea pig movies sounds like your worst nightmare. It sounds just like the goriest, craziest shit you've ever heard.
Excited.
Friend of the show and artist for the show, Trevor Henderson, his review of Mermaid in the Manhole was one word, and it was ew.
What was the rating?
3 stars because I
All
think he
right.
was conflicted about how gross it was.
He's like, I don't know how to feel about this. That's fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. And
So
by the way,
that's
Perry,
all-
if you end up listening to this episode, and I'll probably tell you when I talk to you, but watch Sungazer, and it is incredible. So great work, man.
Hell yeah. You go, Perry. We'll talk to you
Absolutely.
in just 2 weeks' time. But yeah, that being said, I think that wraps it up for everything this week. Thanks so much, guys, for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy.